The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. Happy New Year to you all. I genuinely do hope it's happy. In London, it feels like things are getting worse before they get better. But I do hope you and your families are all safe. Enough about that, though. Let's focus on the other C word, cannabis. We have a great show coming up. We talk a lot about clinical trials when it comes to the topic of medical cannabis, so I thought it would be really good to dig into this and find out a bit more about exactly how the drug development process works. And this episode was recorded pre-Christmas, and we were lucky enough to be able to do it all in person. And it's the first face-to-face one I'd done in nearly a year, I think, and I loved it. I mean, there's a real different energy when you're in the room with someone. So I wonder if you guys notice the difference. We're all really anxious to reconnect in person on a normal and regular basis. And this episode was a great reminder of that for me and how important it is. But anyway, on with the show. Enjoy. On today's show, I have Neil Mahapatra and Gavin Sathianathan, both representing Oxford Cannabinoid Technologies. OCT is a UK biopharmaceutical company focused on cannabinoid drug development. Guys, welcome.
Hello. Great to be here.
Glad to have you. Gavin, welcome back.
Thank you.
How are you doing? It's slightly tumultuous times for the world.
Okay, I think. Yeah.
Just kind of hanging in there, I think. You know, COVID has kind of shot everything down a little bit, but less so, I think, in our market, which seems to still be getting quite strong.
Yes. And we've had positive news from the US in the last couple of days with the states legalising, which is great, but not the topic we're going to focus on today. So, Gavin, you've been on the show before, so perhaps I'll start with Neil. Neil, do you want to just introduce yourself and give us a bit about your background, how you got into...
Sure, how I sort of fell into cannabis. Yeah, so I'm 40. I, sort of in terms of my background, read biology at Oxford, which is kind of part of the reason how OCT began, and then left science almost as quickly as possible and went into investment banking for a few years. Ran away to business school, which is where Gavin and I met. Then after business school, I worked for a family office in investing their money in sort of various private equity and venture capital investments. And then after that, set up my own business, Kingsley Capital Partners. And through Kings, we sort of incubate various companies in different sectors. And Kingsley and Gavin, we founded OCT together.
Fantastic. And what sort of drew you to this area?
To the area? Well, I think it's a few things, really. So probably the first thing is it's rare, I think, that you see a whole new industry coming to light and being created almost from nothing. And it's a once in a generation opportunity, I think. And, related to that, there's a couple of other points. The first is, yes, it's rare that a whole new industry kind of is started, but it's also almost even rarer that there's a whole new industry that starts where the demand is already there and in existence, and it's sort of legislation that sort of catalyzes it and bring it from dark to light, which was, very, very exciting. Probably the second part of it is the fact that I'd set up my own firm, Kingsley. I think when you work at other financial firms, proposing the creation of a cannabis company or a cannabis investment, certainly when we first started to do it, it's a bit like outing yourself, really. And you don't really want to take that risk in kind of most financial firms. But when you run your own, the ability to kind of pivot resources to just start focusing on that and doing a bunch of analysis in it is, much, much easier to do. So it was almost a perfect storm of all of those things, I think.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Great perspective on the entrepreneurial journey.
Yeah, it's part of it feels sort of right time, right place, right time. But as I'm sure there's, a theme that you've come across with lots of people that you've spoken with. I think you've got to be opportunistic about these types of things as well, right? The opportunity coming is one thing, grabbing it is something, completely different.
Yeah. And we'll go on to that in a second, actually. But I'll just hand over to Gav. You've obviously been on the show before, but if you can reintroduce yourself.
Very quick background. So I'm a chemical engineer by training. I guess like Neil, ran away from science into business. When I started my career as a management consultant, we then went to business school together. And then I worked in the tech industry, initially at Endemol, the TV company, making some digital products. I was then one of the early guys at Facebook in Europe. initially working with Europe's early stage startup ecosystem, and then after the Facebook IPO, working with large advertisers to help them move their budgets from print and TV into Facebook. And one of those clients was Tesco. I did a lot of work with Facebook data and club card data and interesting analysis, and I ended up joining Tesco. And then, kind of serendipitously found out about what was happening in the cannabis industry in 2014 in the US. And then sort of Neil and I started exploring. And we set up OCT, and here we are. So,
And it's interesting, 2014 does feel like quite a while ago. And you guys founded OCT in 2017, if I'm correct?
Yeah, it was 2017, but that was off the back of kind of 18 months of work and discussions with Oxford. Any university, I think, takes time to develop a relationship with, let alone get to an agreement, but with one that's, and rightly so, worried about its reputation and all of those types of things. Sort of getting Oxford on side took a while. So yes, it was 2017, but
even then we had a head start because I guess Neil had his relationships both on the academic side, but also on the sort of institutional side because of his previous role as president of the union there. So it was, I think it would have been, I will blow his trumpet for him. I think there was only one person in the UK that could have pulled this off, if I'm honest. We had the relationships at Oxford in the relevant departments to even start the conversation. And it was a long time because at the time, cannabis was still a Schedule 1 substance in the UK. And it was sort of very difficult to even initiate a conversation with anybody about it. So it was a lot of work that was put in to get them comfortable.
Yeah. And GW Pharma aside, it feels like that you're very, one of the early ones. But equally, in 2020, how early do you still feel we are, particularly in Europe?
That's massively early, right? I think one of the
we were joking about this. We were maybe a couple of years too late for that sort of Canadian boom, but we feel way too early for what I think is going to happen in Europe over the next sort of 5 to 8 years in terms of the development of medicines, really.
Yeah.
So I feel that we're just we're approaching the start line. And the gun is about to fire, and then we can start. Really, it's that early.
Yeah.
And I think you're seeing that in the market as well. There's a lot of new companies out there, but some of them are kind of run by sort of cannabis entrepreneurs of old. While the industry is kind of changing, and it's due as it's becoming more mainstream, it is going to professionalise. And I think we'd argue we're at the more professional side of things, despite the fact that we don't like wearing suits and don't shave at all. But we feel that the industry in Europe is finally becoming what we're used to, sort of working in sort of more mainstream environments, sort of Bain and other things. So it's exciting. It is.
Yeah, totally. So let's get on to OCT when we talk a bit more detail about it. In particular, so high level, what does it do? But I'm quite interested in the hookup with Oxford Uni as well. So maybe you can explain a bit about that.
It was born of fluke, born of the fact that I did university. So I did biology at university, and so I hadn't seen my old biology professor at Pembroke, the college I was at, for about since I left in 2003. And then we started to explore the market, and whilst in North America and led by Canada, the market was doing well and was very big, growing and selling cannabis, and who could, at those margins, who could blame anybody for doing that? I think the conclusion we came to is outside of GW Pharma, there is a dearth of companies doing quality research and doing it properly and actually giving a monkeys that it's done. And, this is especially frustrating when you had particularly, it's changed a little bit now, but particularly then, all of these people were growing and selling cannabis in massive inverted commas medical market, saying this has huge medical benefit, when in reality there was kind of a quasi-medical market. People were just using kind of the medical guides in order to get their weed. So we sort of looked at all of that and realised that there's a gap in the market for a quality drug development company. Having realised that, I then went to see my old biology professor. We sent him some materials first. And then I remember he met me at the door of Oxford Plant Sciences, said, I haven't seen you in about 10 years. And then started laughing, weed. But then that led to him introducing us to the medical sciences department at Oxford and various scientists, all of whom were very, very open to proposing research projects, exploring the medical potential of cannabis. And so whilst we were talking to them and discussing that with them, in parallel to that, we began discussing kind of the shape and of a research agreement with the university, which could be called an umbrella agreement, which kind of codifies the way that all of the scientists underneath it would work with us. And that took ages, took absolutely yonks to
And these
to
are
agree.
scientists from the university?
These are scientists that work within the medical sciences department at Oxford. So they fully propped up. At Oxford, they work exclusively with us, which, you know, looking back, it's quite surprising that they do.
But did you, I mean, sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
you clearly the result was positive because you managed to sign an agreement, but were there elements of stigma or apprehension?
Absolutely. And so, interestingly enough, not necessarily at the scientific level. I think researchers remain keen. If something has got medical potential, it should be researched. It's more at the sort of institutional, non-scientist level that there was an element of persuasion that had to happen. So every stage, every meeting was both a meeting to try and progress documentation and things like that, but it was also a pitch, right? To say, look, we are pitching both the idea and also pitching us. We are not clowns. I mean, we are, but you know,
Professional clowns.
Exactly. And so, and that just took ages. But I, to be honest, that's led to the barrier to entry for others. If someone were to do that with any other university, it will take at least 1.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to do it with an Ivy, you know, either here or elsewhere in the world, it will take slightly longer. So it was a hard path to take, but I'm very glad we did.
Yeah, fantastic. And so, you know, what is it exactly that you're doing as part of OCT? And
So what we're doing is researching the medical potential of cannabis and cannabinoids on a series of indications for therapeutic areas, but one in particular, which is sort of pain. And so we have or fund a series of research projects at Oxford using where we send them inputs that we've developed, and the inputs are cannabinoids with a twist. And you know, that's actually part of the secret sauce, so we can't go into too much detail. But what we do is essentially extract cannabinoids, both major and minor, and then apply a couple of chemistry techniques to the cannabinoids, which means, two things happen. One, you can improve their efficacy across different indications or in vivo. So, for example, they can cross cell walls more easily and that type of thing. So that's one of the changes that we make. The second is that you can patent them. A cannabinoid, if it's naturally occurring and unaltered, you cannot patent it because it's a natural product. However, if you change the structure of it slightly, that provides the precursor to a drug candidate because you can actually put regulatory protection around that, which is very important to do before you send it to the research and the scientists, not just at Oxford, other places now as well, because that allows, if something resonates or has a hit and has an effect in one of the experiments, you know that compound can be protected. As opposed, and that's how you create value in the company.
right. And so presumably these tweaks that you're making to the cannabinoids are, just to recap, are aiding delivery and targeting?
Yeah, they do all of those types of things. Yeah. It's a combination of improving their effect and also being able to put legal protections around them.
And are you also looking at terpenes, or is it focused on cannabinoids?
So in time, I think we'd like to. But right now, which is, it's both the exciting part of the cannabis market, also kind of the frustrating part. There's just so much to do. I think we need to begin with the cannabinoids, and then over time we'll move to terpenes, other molecules, start exploring the entourage effects and all of those things. But it's a long road. There's another 5, 10, 15 years of research that needs to be done into this before it really is fully destigmatized, I think, as a genuine medical product.
And I guess the end game is to have a drug at the end of the day.
Absolutely is. The end game is it's kind of the GW pharma.
Well, yeah, I guess it's a drug with marketing authorization, okay, very specifically. Exactly. And so there's sort of two channels to market where cannabis products are sort of getting to patients at the moment. One is through the traditional pharmaceutical route, which is, clinical trials, ultimately with a marketing authorization and a license, I guess, a licensed medicine. And then I guess there's medical cannabis or medicinal cannabis, which sits as an unlicensed medicine today. So these drugs haven't been through the 4 phases of clinical trials. OCT is singularly focused on that licensed pathway. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that's what we're doing, creating marketing authorized drugs.
And if you look at kind of the success that, the leading player in the space arguably has had is GW, it kind of works. It's a longer path to commercialization. It's a much longer path to commercialization. But once you're through that and have got a drug through trials and you've got some regulatory protection around it, your company and that drug is of immense value. And I think that's kind of borne out over the past few years. GW has been doing something like this for over a decade now, right? And if you look at some of the Canadian cannabis companies, that's not a route that they've taken, right? They grow and sell cannabis. It might work medically. They don't really care. Some of them have started to do kind of notional trials, but not proper, genuine molecular stuff. And so what we've seen over the past couple of years is, as the Canadian market has sort of tanked, there's been more of a focus and more resilience shown by companies like GW that have genuine IP. And, that creation of IP is exactly what we're trying to do. I mean, there's various differences that we have versus a GW, but,
Do you to elaborate on that?
Well, I guess GW have taken the phytocannabinoid, so they haven't got sort of synthetic cannabinoids or cannabinoids that they can necessarily patent, but they've applied those phytocannabinoids to rare and orphan indications.
Could you explain what orphan indication is, just so?
An orphan indication is a rare disease, which is so rare, and there's basically three geographical definitions, but the principle is the same. So the US and North America, Europe and Asia, Japan, is a rare disease that, because it's so rare, you do not need to patent your drug according to its structure. You do not need to put a composition of matter patent around a drug for that rare disease. So
I guess there is a sort of economic argument underpinning this, which is that so rare diseases by definition are, I guess, relatively small markets. Not many people have them. They're rare diseases. So how do you incentivize companies to undertake the research to address those indications? And what the regulators say is, look, if there is a plant-based molecule, a naturally occurring molecule that shows therapeutic potential for these rare and orphan diseases, we will find a way to give you some sort of regulatory exclusivity. We'll find a way to make it quote-unquote patentable for you. And so GW has said, okay, we've got Epidiolex, it's 99% CBD, but as it applies to Lennox-Gastaut or Dravet syndrome, we have this sort of exclusivity. Right.
And so what that means is you don't need to change the structure in order to be able to patent it. Right. And so you can take any natural compound and apply it to a specific rare disease, and you get regulatory exclusivity as opposed to a composition of matter patent around the compound. Right. And GW has done it incredibly successfully. And I think the stat is that there's 500 rare diseases or new rare diseases found every month or something like that. I mean, there's a lot of rare diseases out there. Yeah. And it remains to be seen how cannabis and cannabinoids and whole plant extract could help with all of that. So do we do some of that? Yes. Like some of our compounds we are looking to develop for different rare diseases like CRPS, chronic regional pain syndrome. But where I think the slightly longer route, but arguably more valuable route is in the future is to take the cannabinoids where we have changed the structure, and you can therefore put a patent around them and apply them to bigger markets, which aren't rare diseases, sort of the cancers of this world, big pain markets. And that, if you get that right, and we'll know in about 7 to 10 years, then I think that's of immense value, and we hopefully have a potential unicorn on our hands.
Yeah. Wow, there's a lot there, isn't there? I mean, we are going to go into a bit more detail on the drug development process in general. It'd be great to get your insights on that. But in terms of OCT, I mean, as we said earlier, you guys have been around since 2017. Have you pivoted in any way during that time, as most startups need to be agile and respond, or have you had a relatively linear path that you were following?
That's a great question. This will be the point where Gavin contradicts.
No, I think it's been fairly consistent.
Yeah, I think we stuck to our guns.
Yeah.
I think
this
so.
has been fairly consistent. Absolutely.
What would be interesting, I think, is almost the convergence of companies to kind of a more acceptable cannabis product. And by that, what I mean is there's people that are coming from, like us, like GW, that are coming from the angle of IP, moving down into selling cannabis as a therapeutic aid. And there's others, such as the Canadians, who are going from a route where they don't really care about IP and are just sort of selling cannabis. And then
I guess their IP is different, isn't it? I mean, if you think that the model in Canada is more akin to a sort of CPG model, then your IP is brand, right? And yeah, absolutely. Whereas in this case, the European pharmaceutical regulatory framework, it just pushes you to think about IP in a very different way.
Well, exactly. And I think in Europe in particular, there'll be the big markets will be medical, right? It's difficult to see anything going, Luxembourg aside, right? Going any super recreational markets developing in Europe, I think will be some time away. And so then the question is, what's the best way to come from? Is it from the sort of high IP route moving into sort of selling the more sort of medically justifiable sort of CPG route, or is it coming from the sort of North American model where you get the brand side where you can then try and claim some medical characteristics?
Yeah. Look, I guess the analogy in the sort of traditional healthcare world is someone like a Reckitt Benckiser, which is a CPG company which has over-the-counter medicines versus a Pfizer or Glaxo who's coming in, and there's always been a tension in that world between who does consumer versus who over the counter versus who does the traditional pharmaceutical market.
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's dig in a bit on this drug development process, because frequently talk about it, under the guise of medical cannabis and talk about clinical trials, but you haven't really gone into much depth on the show in terms of what that actually means. So, at a high level, would you be able to sort of describe the typical drug development process that, in a non-cannabis world?
So the basic drug development path is you'll have a molecule that you think has some effect, and then before you enter clinical trials, you will do what is called preclinical development, and that's a few things. The first is finding a way that you can replicate mass production of this molecule to the highest standards, to some medicinal standards, to GMP type standards,
and that's consistency.
And that's consistent,
purity.
but not just on a small. It's easy to kind of do in small batches where it becomes harder, and where you have to contract with CROs, with clinical research organisations, is on being able to show that you can produce to a high standard a mass amount of the molecule. So whilst you're doing that, you'll also do in vivo trials, so animal studies, to see if there's some effect and to test basic safety. There's things like sort of therapeutic indexes, and sort of you use dogs, rats, all those types of things where you kind of want to test how much you can give to an animal before something serious starts to happen. And that sort of sets the boundaries of which you can offer that drug, or what concentrations you can. And so that's kind of the preclinical aspect of it. And then you move, once it's sort of passed through that, you move into three phases of trials, right? The first is phase 1 clinical trials with people, which is always safety based, right? So it's a smallish trial where you're not really looking at efficacy, but you just want to make sure that the potential drug does not hurt or harm people. Once that's proven, you then move into phase 2 and phase 3, and which are very, very similar. Look at efficacy, but phase 3 involves many more people. And the cost of these things progressively escalate as you go through. So you've passed phase 1, you've shown it doesn't hurt anything. Phase 2, you then get a cohort of patients that have a particular indication that you're testing the drug for, test if it is effective. And it's not just, is it effective? One of the key aspects is it more effective than the best treatments on the market right now? And then assuming that it passes through phase 2, you then do phase 3, which is a very similar study, but just more people. And then assuming you've got through all of those trials, and if you've got to phase 3, you are sitting on a very lucrative compound, then you have to go through, registration, marketing, all of these things that you have to deal with European health authorities, the FDA, if it's in the US. And then, after about 7 to 10 years, you have finished, and you have a drug that you can then sell on the market. And it's at that point that you will have been granted your patents, which gives you 20 years of exclusivity, and that protected route is therefore very, very, very lucrative. The downsides of this is that the costs are very, very expensive. But the slightly interesting thing is, the variance in costs of clinical trials can vary by 300 times. Sometimes you hear of clinical trials that are, a couple of million. Other times you hear of clinical trials that are 350 million. It depends on the amount of how easy it is to recruit those patients, how many doctors you need, how many visits they need to do in order to maintain the trial. All of these things kind of stack up to create what, in the worst case, can be a huge amount of money that you spent developing a drug. Yeah. All that being said, if you've got it to that stage, it means your drug is potentially very, very, very valuable, which is why you have these very large pharmaceutical companies, or biotech, not integrated pharma, biotech companies who are not selling yet, but worth a couple of billion, will then raise 300 million in order to push their drug through the later stages of trials. So, and what I think is interesting for what we're doing is that cannabis, because it's a natural compound, the phase 1 part of it, the probability of success, is higher than with many other drugs. So the pharmaceutical industry, sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say, I guess, because, and I think it's common to lots of recreational drugs, we almost have a good understanding of the safety profile because these things are used out in the wild, right?
As you said, was it like toxicity or potential for harm is one of the first gates that you need to go through, and if we already have knowledge of that in some way.
Yeah, I think we have uninstrumented data sets in the wild from people using these products at scale every week, every day, and I think we can start to glean some safety data from just cannabis as it's used in the illicit channel.
Yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you, both of you. Really, I had Ethan Russo on the show, and he mentioned about clinical trials costing north of 800 million and taking a long time, but we never went into any detail on what that actually means. So it's a brilliant summary you just did there. Are there any alternative methods? So you said that it can be a bit shorter and cheaper, but are there any alternative drug development processes outside of clinical trials? Or is this the main way that...
Yeah, so there's a sort of, the way I describe it is that there is a pyramid of evidence, and at the top of the pyramid, the gold standard is the RCT, right? So you take a drug through these phases of clinical trials.
RCT.
So randomized control trials. So double blind, you have a placebo group, you have a group that's not receiving the drug, a group that is receiving the drug, and then you see what the differences are, right? That is the sort of gold standard. Beyond that, though, there are other ways of collecting evidence. And I think, look, when we look at Europe, there is the sort of registry that is being developed in lots of different countries where we say, look, we want to collect observational data, sort of unconstrained observational data about how patients are consuming cannabis, what the impact is on their symptoms, on their quality of life. And we can gather a lot of data in that way. It may not be the gold standard, but I think the sort of future of data collection in healthcare really is, I talk about this a lot, we have ubiquitous mobile computing now with phones and wearables. And really we can start to think about a different paradigm for collecting data. So less through this sort of very structured RCT mechanism, but, real world evidence, real world data, which leads to real world evidence that we can provide to regulators to show them how these drugs are being used by people and what the effects are.
Yeah.
And so in the UK, we have Project 2021. The Sapphire Clinic have a registry. In Denmark, there is a scheme that the Danish government are running. The French ANSM is talking about their sort of large-scale study that is going to be launched, I think, later this year or early next. I know BfArM in Germany are capturing structured data from their circa 100,000 patients. So there are different ways to gather this data. It just so happens, though, that the medical establishment can really get behind the sort of gold standard. Yeah. And it's more challenging with other types of evidence, and we've got some work to do.
And that was the bit that I meant to say but forgot when we were talking about the sort of clinical sort of and drug development route, because once you've got a drug through trials, that is not the end of it. But you then have to persuade the medical community that this is the drug that they can then offer to patients, right? And doctors, in many ways, it's the value of the RCT is an arse covering exercise, right? Because the doctors feel...
So badge of quality,
correct, right? They feel much more comfortable offering a drug that has gone through RCT and then as a alternative for a particular indication to their patients than other data. So one of the problems with the cannabis market is, and has always been, and it's becoming less so now, but is persuading the medical community that cannabis is a viable therapeutic aid.
Yeah, so I always say it's safe, efficacious, and cost effective.
Yeah.
That's what we need to persuade the medical establishment of. And there are called the evidence base that we need to build a jigsaw puzzle. And I think there are different pieces that will be put in place, and a lot of those pieces, the big pieces, will come from the RCT world. But there are other pieces of evidence that will come from registries and other types of data collection.
Yeah, and good. I think it's good that we're expanding the kind of paradigm, as you say, in that respect. So I think you alluded to it a bit with why actually cannabis or natural plant-derived drugs have maybe a slight advantage in this process because of the safety issues. Are there any other peculiarities to a plant-based rather than the purely synthetic drug development process?
Well, aside from, so I think probability of success is arguably higher. I think, to take a step back in the in the late 90s and 2000s, the pharmaceutical market went through a big wave of synthetic chemistry and sort of big molecule drugs, where they tried to create these drugs, these synthetically driven drugs, to create and try to see if they could work on a variety of indications. And in general, it didn't work. It was not, compared to the money they spent, it was not the biggest success. And so there's been this kind of flip back to more holistic, more natural product-driven drugs, which I think is kind of right for us and the cannabis market. So, for example, our molecule, our lead compound is for treating sort of pain and irritable bowel syndrome and associated and chronic regional pain syndrome. It's a natural compound that has had some sort of chemistry applied to it for all of the reasons that we sort of just talked about, which in many ways I think represents the best of both worlds, because the advantage to all of the synthetic driven compounds that kind of didn't necessarily work with pharma is that you knew you could protect them, even though they didn't necessarily work.
So, we're trying to amend the properties of the cannabinoid to improve their therapeutic benefit. And that can be, bioavailability or pharmacokinetics. One way to sort of think about an analogy is Rafi Mikulim, his 90th birthday this week, has talked about the methyl ester of CBD being more effective than CBD itself. And so I think there are variants upon the cannabinoids that we need to explore to figure out, what is most effective for the patient. And that is sort of what OCT is doing.
Yeah. And without getting into a debate around the entourage effect, how do you feel about what's the attitude in terms of multiple compounds working together?
I think there's huge merit to it. However, I also think it's going to take ages before there's a proper understanding around it. And in order to develop that understanding, I think you need to look at all of the individual aspects first and kind of build up from there.
So that's where we're at the moment. We need to go deep on each individual cannabinoid.
I think so.
Before we put the pieces together.
The way I sort of look at it is at sort of one pole, you've got the Western pharmaceutical model of, single molecule, single receptor. At the other pole, you've got Eastern plant-based medical models, which talk about the entourage, and they actually have kind of concepts which are not native to our understanding of medicine. But, if you look at Ayurvedic medicine or traditional Chinese medicine, the notion of multiple compounds acting together and each compound playing a different role in the human body is entirely normal. And the WHO came out in 2014 and said, look, actually, there are sort of merits to both approaches, and we'll end up landing, I think, somewhere in the middle. And so I get very excited about the idea of using sort of computational power to understand what is going on with lots of different combinations of molecules. That is sort of where I think we'll end up.
Yeah. Very interesting. That's a big debate on its own. So, okay, so as we come towards the end, as you've explained the process, and even if it's a relatively simple thing, it still costs a lot of money, right? Yeah. How does a startup get into this vis-a-vis a Pfizer? Where do you find that patient capital that's going to be willing to stick around for 10 years?
I think that the first point I make is that's kind of how biotech works, right? And so biotech, traditionally for decades, they've kind of found an interesting molecule, raised a little bit of money to take it through the early stages of development. The value of their company's gone up. They've raised a bit more to take it through phase 1, arguably phase 2. And at that point, that's when pharma buys them, right? And so pharma in general, big pharma, they do a fair amount of sort of internal clinical development and preclinical. But, a huge part of their success is just buying biotech. So our model is similar. We are a biotech firm that's working in the substrate of cannabis, but it's a biotech model. Where do we find the patient capital? I think the truth is we're very lucky in terms of some of the investors and shareholders that we've got already. So we first, we started speaking to Oxford in 2015, signed up the agreement in 2017. That's when we created OCT. We did a small seed round at the end of 17, and then in 2018, we're very, very lucky to Gavin brought in Imperial Brands, one of the biggest tobacco firms on the planet, wanted to learn more about cannabis and the effects of it. And we also had Casa Verde Capital, who I'm sure
Karen's coming on the show in a few weeks.
Is he? Well, do send him our regards. Right? And so Karen is on the board of OCT along with a representative of Imperial, and it's great supportive money. In the future, who knows what we'll contemplate. We're looking at a range of fundraising options right now, both private and public. That will get us to the next stage in development. Hopefully, the value of our company will then go up further. And at that stage, there'll be a fork in the road, right? If we've got something through to the end of phase 2, we could either raise more money and do it ourselves, or that's also the time that you start speaking to pharma about licensing deals, about acquisitions, and all of those types of things.
Yeah. So there is a path. There
is a path. It feels fairly well trodden outside of cannabis, and we're now just trying to emulate it within cannabis.
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting. Just my thoughts for a couple of minutes. We had some interesting conversations in sort of 2018 when it was a very bubbly North American market, but we both felt quite nervous about the types of conversations we're having. We've obviously had this big implosion through 2019. But what I think has happened this year is that the cannabis market in North America, because of things like this legislative movement that we had this week, and the fact that the revenue numbers for all these companies have really grown impressively, the sort of mood music around cannabis generally, I think, has really shifted this year from being very negative in 2019 to actually being very positive as we sit here today, looking at what the US market could deliver. I think you put that in combination with what's happening in sort of healthcare, in this very dire COVID economy, there's a lot of money going into healthcare because we've all realized we need to retool our healthcare systems. And so I think the macro environment for OCT is actually quite positive, sitting sort of at the intersection of these two trends, a realization that cannabis is sort of here to stay and it's legitimate and it's growing quickly, and a recognition that we need sort of new drugs, new ways of delivering healthcare. So I'm, bullish about where we can take OCT over the next few years. Very excited.
The other thing that the UK has versus most other countries on earth, which is that makes me very proud to be British, is the NHS, right? And so if you can get something through trials, generate that proper data that can persuade the medical community, then you also have a very willing state-funded buyer for your pharma drug, which I think makes this the right country to start, to pursue all of this sort of development path.
Yeah, particularly for the area of pain, I would imagine.
Yeah, and absolutely.
I've done a couple of shows on it, but that's a whole topic in it itself, and it would be good to get you guys on again to talk about that and go deep into actually that topic there.
So our first research was published in the Journal of Pain this year.
We did a pain study. One of our researchers at Oxford, Professor Zamkeda, through him, we're researching potential across a variety of pain indications, and he produced his first paper in the leading pain publication called Pain. And
he's doing interesting stuff with stem cells.
It's
fascinating work. He works at the Stem Cell Bank in Oxford, and he grows cells, and he is firing cannabinoids to see what the pain responses are. It's really innovative work.
It is, but it's also, the interesting thing is it also shows just how far you've got to go as well, because his paper was an excellent paper. What it's effectively said is there is a pathway that cannabinoids can act on, right? It's not more advanced than that, but in order to persuade the medical community, you need to start from the very, very beginning, right? That says, hold on, he's done all this research, he's looked into the different physiological pathways of pain, and he's absolutely shown that there is a path that cannabinoids can act on, but it hasn't shown that there's a molecule R's or anything that works on X, Y, and Z, but you've got to start from here. This is why it's going to take a long time before it's truly accepted. I think.
Yeah, no, I had Teddy Mary on the show talking about his cancer research and same thing. Great. He's a fascinating guy doing some incredible work, but is always sort of gives the health warning that we have a long way to go. Exactly. So there's no doubt it's the same with you guys. Guys, it's been really good, and we could literally talk for hours, so thank you. And this definitely feels like we need to do a follow-up to this on a number of topics.
Yeah, we'd love to. Thank you very much for your time.
No, pleasure.
Thanks, Ange.
Cheers.